The late afternoon sun filtered through the high windows of the university practice hall, casting long, dusty beams of light across the polished floor. It was that time of day when the building felt heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional muffled sound of an instrument from a distant room. For most people, this was a time to pack up and go home. But for her, this was the only time she could be here. She sat at the old, slightly out-of-tune upright piano tucked away in the corner. The instrument had seen better days. Some of the keys were yellowed with age, and the pedal was a little loose, but to her it was perfect. She was 45 years old, with hair just starting to show streaks of gray at the temples and hands that told the story of a hard life. Her skin was rough, and her fingers were stiff from years of working with heavy fabrics and sewing machines in the factory. A district across town. She had worked a double shift that day. Her bones ached, and her eyes burned with fatigue, but the pull to be here was stronger than the need to sleep. She looked down at the sheet music spread out before her. It was a photocopy of a copy, the notes slightly blurred, but she didn't mind. She was trying to learn a piece she had heard only once, a melody that had grabbed hold of her heart and wouldn't let go. It was complex, full of sweeping runs and tricky timing. Nothing like the simple folk songs she had learned as a child. She took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. Her touch was gentle, almost hesitant, as if she was afraid the instrument might break under her fingers. She started to play. At first the sound was shaky. Her fingers, usually so fast at threading needles, felt clumsy and thick on the ivory keys. She missed a note, then another. She stopped, took a shaky breath, and tried again. In the center of the room, 3 students were rehearsing together. They were young, barely 20, with the kind of effortless confidence that comes from youth and privilege. One held a violin, another a cello, and the third stood with a sheet music stand. Conducting them was small, sharp movements. They were loud, their energy filling the room. But they stopped when they heard the stumbling. Piano music from the corner. The tall young man with the violin lowered his instrument and turned to look. He didn't try to hide his annoyance. He nudged the girl standing next to him, a flute player with a pristine, shiny instrument. She giggled, covering her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were cold. "Is she ever going to get it right?" the violinist asked, his voice carrying clearly across the room. He didn't whisper. He didn't care if she heard. "It sounds like a bag of nails being dropped down a staircase." The third student, a young man with neatly combed hair, shook his head. "I don't know why they let just anyone in here to practice," he said, looking directly at the woman at the piano. "It's distracting. Some people should really just accept that they're too old to start. It's kind of sad, isn't it?" The laughter started low but grew louder. It wasn't the kind of laughter that shared joy. It was the kind that tore things down. It was sharp and cruel. The woman at the piano froze. Her hands hovered over the keys, mid-note. The blood rushed to her face, making her cheeks burn hot. She didn't turn around to look at them. She didn't want to see the smug smiles or the pity in their eyes. She just sat there, staring at the blurry notes on the paper, feeling small and foolish. She had known deep down that she didn't belong here. She was a mother, a worker, someone who spent her days worrying about bills and groceries. She wasn't an artist. She wasn't gifted. The laughter confirmed everything she had ever feared about herself. It told her that her dream was a joke. Slowly, she pulled her hands back from the keyboard. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. She could feel their eyes on her back, waiting to see what she would do, waiting for her to break down or fight back. She did neither. With trembling hands, she began to gather her sheet music. She handled the paper carefully, smoothing out a crease with her thumb, trying to hold on to some small piece of dignity. She closed the fallboard over the keys, the soft thud sounding final in the quiet room. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She grabbed her worn canvas bag from the floor and slung it over her shoulder. She kept her head down, focusing on the scuff marks on the floor, avoiding eye contact with the trio in the center of the room. As she walked toward the exit, the violinist played a deliberate, mocking trill, mimicking her earlier mistake. The laughter bubbled up again, sharper this time. She pushed through the heavy metal doors and stepped out into the corridor. The air here was cooler, but it didn't help the heat in her face. She walked quickly, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum tiles. She wanted to run, but she forced herself to walk at a steady pace. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her run. The corridor felt endless. Posters of past concerts and famous musicians lined the walls, their smiling faces seeming to mock her as well. "Look at what you will never be," they seemed to say. She finally reached the side exit and pushed out into the evening air. The sun had dipped below the city's skyline, painting the sky in shades of purple and gray. The streetlights were flickering on, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. She walked to the bus stop, the weight of her bag feeling heavier than it ever had before. She sat on the hard metal bench and wrapped her coat tighter around herself against the chill wind. Tears blurred her vision, but she wiped them away quickly with the back of her hand. She was used to hiding her tears. She had done it plenty of times when the rent was due, or when the car broke down, or when her children were sick and she couldn't afford medicine. But this was different. This hurt in a place that money couldn't fix. It was a hurt that went straight to her soul. The bus arrived with a loud hiss of air and the screech of brakes. She stood up and shuffled toward the doors, showing her pass to the driver without looking him in the eye. She found an empty seat near the back, by the window, and sank into it as the bus pulled away from the curb. Rumbling over the potholes in the street, she watched the university building disappear in the distance. It was a grand building, full of light and music, but it was not a place for her. She realized now that there were some doors that were meant to stay closed, and some dreams that were meant to remain dreams. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were rough, red, and chapped. These were hands that worked, hands that served. They were not hands that were meant to create beauty. The laughter of the students echoed in her mind again, replaying over and over like a broken record. Asterisk, it's kinda sad, isn't it? Asterisk, yes, she whispered to the empty bus, her voice barely audible. It is. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass of the window and watched the city pass by. The neon signs from the shops flashed by in a blur of color. People were walking home, laughing, talking on their phones, living their lives. She felt invisible, a ghost floating through a world that had no place for her by the time she got off at her stop. The anger had faded, leaving only a hollow emptiness behind. She walked the 3 blocks to her apartment building, her head down, counting the cracks in the sidewalk to keep her mind occupied. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, because the elevator was broken again. When she unlocked the door to her small apartment, the smell of stale cooking grease and age greeted her. It was not a grand home, but it was hers. It was safe. She flipped the light switch, illuminating the cramped living space. In the corner, covered by a cloth to keep the dust off, sat her keyboard. It was a cheap electric model she had bought secondhand from a pawn shop. She had saved up for it for 6 months, skipping lunches and walking to work to save bus fare. It was the most expensive thing she owned, and looking at it now, felt like a giant mistake. She walked past it without touching it and went into the tiny kitchen. She turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on her face, trying to wash away the feeling of shame. She looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. Her eyes looked tired, older than her years. "Stop it," she told herself harshly. "You have work tomorrow. You have to sleep." She went back into the main room and sat in her armchair. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Outside, she could hear the faint hum of traffic and the distant bark of a dog. She sat there for a long time, staring at the wall, not moving. The silence of the room felt heavy, pressing down on her shoulders. It was the silence of failure. It was the silence of giving up. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like fighting it. She just let the silence take her. She sat in the armchair for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the tiny kitchenette. The apartment was dark, save for the street lamp outside that cast a faint orange glow through the blinds. Usually this time of night was her sanctuary. After a long day at the factory, stripping away her work clothes and washing the grime from her skin felt like shedding a heavy coat. But tonight, the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt heavy. It felt like a judgment. Her eyes drifted across the small room to the far corner. There, draped in an old bedsheet to keep the dust off, sat the electric keyboard. It looked like a ghost in the dim light, a humped shape that reminded her of the foolish hopes she had been harboring. She had bought it 6 months ago from a pawn shop 2 towns over. She remembered the day clearly. It had taken her months of saving, of skipping lunch, of walking to work in the rain just to save the bus fare. Every dollar she tucked away felt like a brick in the foundation of a new life she was trying to build. When she brought it home, she set it up on the dining table, pushing aside the stacks of bills and the mail she didn't want to open. For a few weeks, she played every night. She taught herself the notes. She learned where middle C was. She practiced scales until her fingers ached. It was clumsy and noisy, but it was hers. It was a spark of color in a gray world. But now, looking at that shape under the sheet, she didn't feel joy. She felt sick to her stomach. She stood up slowly, her joints popping. She walked over to the table and stood before the keyboard. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and pulled the sheet away. The instrument looked cheap up close. The keys were made of lightweight plastic, and the casing was scratched from its previous life. To the students at the university, this thing would be a toy. Something for a child. To her, it had been a treasure. She reached out and plugged in the power cord. The little red light on the side blinked on. She sat down on the hard wooden chair she used as a bench. She placed her hands in her lap. They were trembling. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, trying to summon the courage to just play one note. She lifted her hands and hovered them over the keys. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the melody she loved so much, the one that made her heart swell. But before her fingers could even touch the plastic, she heard the voice of the young man with the violin again. Asterisk. It sounds like a bag of nails. Asterisk. Asterisk. Some people should just accept that they're too old. Asterisk. The words slammed into her, knocking the wind out of her. Her hands froze in midair. She could feel the heat rising in her neck again. The same humiliation she had felt in the practice hall washing over her once more. She wasn't imagining it. It was the truth. She looked down at her hands. They were rough and scarred. The knuckles were swollen from years of repetitive motion at the sewing machine. The skin was dry. These were not the hands of a musician. These were workers' hands. They were meant to hold needles and fabric, meant to scrub floors and carry heavy loads. They were ugly and hard. She looked at the white plastic keys. They were smooth and perfect. They didn't belong together. What was I thinking? She whispered into the empty room. Her voice cracked. Who am I kidding? She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. She felt angry at herself for being so stupid, for believing that she could ever be something more than what she was. She was a woman from the factory. She was a mother. She was tired. That was her identity. There was no room for art. There was no room for music. With a sudden surge of frustration, she reached out and grabbed the power cord. She yanked it from the socket. The little red light died instantly. The silence rushed back in, filling the void instantly, thicker than before. She stared at the dark machine. She felt like crying, but she was too tired for tears. She just felt empty. She grabbed the bedsheet from the floor and threw it back over the keyboard, covering it up roughly. She tucked the corners in, hiding it away, as if not seeing it would make the shame go away. She turned away and walked to the window. She pulled the blind up and looked out at the city. It was alive down there. Cars were moving like glowing beetles on the highway. People were walking in and out of the corner store. The world was turning. And nobody knew that a dream had just died in a small apartment on the 3rd floor. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The cold felt good. It numbed the heat in her face. She thought about the next day. She had to be up at 5 in the morning. The alarm would blare, jarring her out of sleep. She would drink instant coffee, pack a meager lunch, and walk to the bus stop. She would spend 8 hours hunched over a loud machine, stitching seams until her eyes blurred. Then she would come home, cook dinner, pay a bill, and go to sleep. That was the cycle. That was the pattern of her life. It had been that way for 20 years. For the last 6 months, she had broken the pattern. She had allowed herself a little bit of magic. She had allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, She had something else inside her. But reality had caught up with her. The universe had a way of reminding you of your place. The laughter of the students echoed in her head again. It wasn't their fault, really. They were just stating the obvious. It was her fault for refusing to see it. She was the intruder. She was the one who didn't fit in. She turned away from the window and walked to the small bathroom. She brushed her teeth with slow, mechanical strokes. She looked at herself in the mirror again. The woman staring back looked defeated. "Get a grip," she whispered to her reflection. "You have work tomorrow." She turned off the bathroom light and went to her bedroom. She lay down on the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The mattress was lumpy and the pillow was flat. She closed her eyes, hoping that sleep would come quickly. She didn't want to think. She didn't want to feel. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was racing. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the grand piano in the university hall. She saw the dust motes dancing in the light. She saw the smug faces of the young people. She rolled over and punched her pillow. She squeezed her eyes shut tight. She tried to think of other things. She tried to think of the grocery list. She tried to think of the laundry she needed to do. But the music was still there, haunting her from the edges of her mind. It was the melody she had tried to play, the one that was so beautiful. It was trapped inside her now, with nowhere to go. She lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building settling. The pipes clanged in the walls. Her upstairs neighbor stomped across the floor. The city hummed outside. It was a distant, indifferent noise. It didn't care about her. It didn't care about her dreams. The world kept turning whether she played music or not. Eventually, the exhaustion from the double shift caught up with her. Her breathing slowed down. Her muscles relaxed. She drifted into a restless sleep, filled with dreams where she was running down long hallways trying to find a door that was locked, while someone played a beautiful song on the other side that she could never quite reach. 3 days passed, and the electric keyboard in the corner of the apartment remained covered by the old bedsheet. It sat there like a piece of furniture she had stopped using, gathering dust in the shadows. Every morning when she woke up, her eyes would drift toward it, and every time she would quickly look away, a sharp pang of guilt piercing her chest. She had unplugged it, and she had made a silent promise to herself that she was done with that foolishness. She was done trying to be something she wasn't. Going back to work felt like walking into a deep fog. The factory was the same as it always was, loud, hot, and smelling of oil and fabric. The massive machines roared like living beasts, their metal arms punching and stitching in a rhythm that never changed. Usually, the noise comforted her. It was predictable. It was steady. But now the noise felt like a cage. The rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the looms seemed to mock her, reminding her of the stumbling notes she had played at the university. She kept her head down, her hands moving automatically over the fabric. She was fast, one of the best workers on the floor, but her heart wasn't in it. She felt like a robot, just going through the motions. When the lunch whistle blew, she didn't sit with the other women in the break room. She didn't want to talk about the weather or the price of milk. She grabbed her small paper bag and walked outside. The air was cool and crisp, a sharp contrast to the stuffy air inside the factory. The loading docks were busy with trucks, but she walked past them, turning toward the small patch of green that the city called a park. It wasn't much, just a few rows of trees, some benches, and a fountain that didn't always work. But it was quiet. She found an empty metal bench near the edge of the park and sat down. She unwrapped her sandwich, taking a small bite, but she wasn't really hungry. She just needed to be away from the noise. She watched a stray dog sniffing around a trash can in the distance and saw a mother pushing a stroller along the paved path. Everything looked normal. Everyone else seemed to know exactly where they belonged. She felt a heavy sigh escape her lips. She leaned back against the bench and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to quiet the storm in her head. Without thinking about it, she started to hum. It was a low, soft sound, barely audible over the distant traffic. It was the melody from the sheet music, the one she had failed to play. It was the song that had grabbed her heart and refused to let go. She hummed a few bars, then stopped, realizing what she was doing. She looked around nervously, hoping no one had heard. The last thing she needed was for someone to hear her terrible singing voice on top of everything else. On the bench next to her, separated by a low armrest, sat an older man. He had been sitting there when she arrived, quietly whittling away at a piece of wood with a small pocket knife. He had a cap pulled low over his eyes and a worn coat that looked like it had seen many winters. She hadn't paid much attention to him, assuming he was just resting. She looked down at her sandwich, determined to sit in silence. But then, the man spoke. You have an ear for the pauses," he said. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves crunching underfoot.
What?
But it was kind. She jumped slightly, startled that he had spoken to her. She looked over at him. He didn't look up from his wood carving. He just kept scraping the knife against the block. "I'm sorry," she asked, confused. "The music you were humming?" he said calmly. Most people rush through the silence. They rush to get to the next note. They think the music is only in the sound. But you were holding on to the silence. You were lingering. She felt her face get hot. She hadn't realized she was doing that. She just remembered how the music sounded in her head, the way the notes seemed to hang in the air before disappearing. She shook her head, looking down at her hands. "I was just humming," she mumbled. "I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not a musician." She expected him to nod, to agree, to tell her to be quiet so he could enjoy his peace. Instead, he stopped whittling and looked up. His eyes were a pale blue, sharp and clear, looking right through her. "Music isn't about knowing what you're doing," he said softly. "And it sure isn't about being perfect. It's about the need. If you have the need to make the sound, the tune will follow." He held up the piece of wood he was carving. It was starting to look like a bird, though it was still rough and unfinished. "I'm no master carver," he said. "My hands shake a bit. But I see a bird in this block of wood, and I have to let it out. That's all that matters. You have a song in you, and you have to let it out." The woman stared at him, her mouth slightly open. She waited for the mockery. She waited for him to laugh at her, to tell her she was too old, just like the boy at the university. But his face was serious. There wasn't a hint of a smile, but there wasn't a hint of cruelty either. It was just a simple statement of truth, as plain as the bench they were sitting on. "But I'm terrible," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I tried to play. People laughed. They said I was. I was a joke. They said I'm too old to start." The old man went back to scraping the wood. She. The sound was rhythmic and soothing. "Age is just a number on a clock," he said after a moment. "And people laugh because they are scared. They are scared that someone with more passion than talent will outshine them. Or they laugh because they are foolish. Let them laugh." He paused and blew the wood shavings off the bird. "You think the birds outside care if the other birds think they sing pretty? They sing because the sun came up. They sing because they have a song. You hummed because you had a song. Don't let someone else's noise stop your music." He turned his head and looked at her again. "Why did you stop playing?" She looked away, toward the fountain. The water was shooting up in a weak, sporadic stream. "Because it hurt," she admitted. "It hurt to try so hard and be so bad. It hurt to see how easy it is for everyone else." "Nothing easy is worth keeping," the old man said. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking. He placed the wooden bird on the armrest between them. "Here, for you." She looked at the rough carving. It wasn't smooth. The wings weren't perfectly symmetrical. But it had spirit. It looked like it was about to take flight. "I can't take this," she said. "You made it." Shook his head and pulled his coat tighter around him. "I have plenty of wood at home. This one needs to fly. Just like you." He touched the brim of his cap and walked away, moving slowly but steadily down the path. She watched him go until he disappeared around the bend. Leaving her alone on the bench with the wooden bird in her hand, she picked it up. It was light and still smelled of fresh pine. She ran her thumb over the rough wings. It wasn't a masterpiece. You could see the knife marks. You could see where he had slipped and carved a little too deep. But it was beautiful. It was real. She looked down at her sandwich, wrapped back in its wax paper. She wasn't hungry, but she didn't feel that heavy, crushing weight in her chest anymore. The shame was still there, lingering like a bruise. But it wasn't as sharp. The old man's words rattled around in her head. Asterisk music isn't about the tune. It's about the need. Asterisk, did she have the need? She thought about how she felt when the melody played in her mind. It made the gray world look a little brighter. It made the factory noise a little quieter. It made her feel like there was more to her than just a worker, a mother, a tired woman. She looked at the wooden bird again. It had flaws, but it existed. It was there. She wrapped the bird carefully in a napkin and put it in her pocket, right next to her keys. She stood up, throwing the rest of her lunch in the trash can. She didn't know if she would play tonight. She was still scared. The fear of being laughed at was a powerful thing. But as she walked back toward the factory, the rhythm of her footsteps felt a little different. For the first time in 3 days, she wasn't walking away from the music. She was just pausing. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to try again. The silence in her head didn't feel so empty anymore. It felt like a pause before the next note. She went back to the university the following evening. It was not a decision she made with excitement. It was a decision she made with a quiet sort of desperation. The words of the old man in the park had stuck with her all through the afternoon shift at the factory. Asterisk. If you have the need to make the sound, the tune will follow. She wasn't sure if she had the need, but she knew she couldn't just let it go. She had to try one more time, if only to prove to herself that she could walk through the fear. It was much later than her usual time. The sun had long since set, and the sky was a deep velvety black dotted with city stars. The university campus was quiet. Most of the students had gone to the dorms or out to dinner, and the streetlights cast long, lonely shadows across the pavement. She walked with her head down, clutching her worn canvas bag against her side. The night air was chilly, biting at her cheeks, but she didn't mind the cold. It made her feel alert. When she reached the music building, the main entrance was locked. A heavy chain was wrapped around the handles, secured with a padlock. She stood there for a moment, her heart sinking. She should have expected this. It was nighttime. Of course, it would be locked. She turned to leave, feeling like the universe was giving her a sign to turn back and go home to her safe, silent apartment. But then, she remembered the side entrance near the rehearsal rooms. It was usually used for loading equipment. Sometimes the students propped it open to sneak out for a smoke or a late-night coffee. She walked around the side of the building, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path, to her relief. The heavy metal side door was slightly ajar. It was dark inside, and the air smelled of floor wax and old instruments. She slipped through the gap, the metal door clicking shut behind her. She stood in the dimly lit corridor for a moment, listening. The building was humming, the low groan of the heating pipes echoing through the walls. She felt like a ghost in her own school, invisible and out of place. She knew where she wanted to go. She didn't want to go back to the practice hall where the students had laughed at her. She couldn't face that room. Instead, she headed toward the main recital hall. It was a grand room with high ceilings and velvet curtains, used for official concerts and faculty recitals. Students weren't usually allowed in there without a teacher. But she hoped that late at night, nobody would notice. When she reached the double doors at the front of the hall, she found them unlocked. She pushed one of them open just wide enough to slip through. The inside of the hall was breathtaking, even in the dark. The stage was vast, stretching out like a wide ocean of wood. In the center of the stage, bathed in a single, dramatic beam of light from a spotlight that had been left on, sat the grand piano. It was a beast of an instrument, black and shiny, gleaming under the light. It looked terrifying and magnificent all at once. The auditorium itself was a sea of darkness. Hundreds of empty seats stretched back into the shadows, waiting for an audience that wasn't there. The silence in this room was different from the silence in her apartment. It wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was sacred. It was the kind of silence that demanded respect. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the carpeted floor. As she got closer to the stage, her heart began to pound harder against her ribs. This was a faculty instrument. It was worth more money than she would make in 10 years. What was she doing here? If a security guard caught her, she would be thrown out, maybe even arrested. She reached the edge of the stage and hesitated. She looked up at the single light shining down on the piano keys. It looked like a spotlight from heaven, or maybe a trap. She thought about the old man's wooden bird sitting on her table at home. It wasn't perfect, but it was free. She climbed the 3 wooden steps onto the stage. The wood felt smooth under her feet. She walked across the vast expanse until she was standing right in front of the piano. Up close, it was even more intimidating. The black lacquer reflected her own image back at Hersmal, tired and old in her worn coat. She sat down on the bench. It was plush and firm, much more comfortable than the dining chair she used at home. She placed her hands on her knees and took a deep breath. She could smell the faint scent of lemon polish and dust. For a long time, she didn't touch the keys. She just sat there, letting her eyes adjust to the light. She felt small in this giant room, but strangely, she also felt protected. The shadows of the empty seats seemed to be guarding her. There were no students here to laugh. There was no one to judge. Slowly, she lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth, much nicer than the plastic of her keyboard. She was afraid to press down, afraid that the sound would be too loud, that it would shatter the silence of the hall. She closed her eyes. She blocked out the fear. She didn't think about the notes on the page or the technical difficulty of the piece. She didn't think about the young man with the violin. She thought about the feeling she had when she first heard the music. She thought about the pause the old man had talked about. She pressed a chord. The sound that came out was huge. It resonated through the body of the piano, bouncing off the high ceiling and filling the entire hall. It wasn't a clunky, clumsy noise. It was rich and deep. It vibrated in her chest. She froze for a second, shocked by the beauty of the sound. Then she took another breath and began to play. She didn't play perfectly. Her fingers still stumbled occasionally. She still missed a note here and there. But she didn't stop. She didn't apologize to the empty room. She played with feeling. She leaned into the music, swaying slightly with the rhythm. Because the piano was so good, even her mistakes sounded somewhat intentional. Turning into dissonant jazz notes that added to the emotion, she played the melody. Loud and clear, letting it soar into the rafters. She poured her loneliness into the music. She poured in the years of standing at the factory machine, the nights of worry about bills, the feeling of being invisible. All of it went into the keys. The music filled the vast space, swirling around the empty seats. It wasn't a performance for a crowd. It was a conversation with the darkness. And for the first time, she felt like she was speaking the right language. She wasn't an intruder anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. She was a woman making a sound because she needed to, and in that moment, the sound was beautiful. The final chord rang out into the vast emptiness of the hall. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to hang in the air like heavy smoke, refusing to fade away. She sat with her hands still resting on the keys, her chest heaving slightly. Her fingers were trembling, but not from fear this time. They were vibrating from the sheer force of the music she had just poured out of herself. For a long moment, she kept her eyes closed, afraid that if she opened them, the spell would break. She wanted to stay inside that sound, wrapped up in the echo of her own voice. Just a little longer. Slowly, the sound did fade, melting away into the high rafters of the ceiling until the hall was completely silent again. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of her apartment or the mocking silence of the practice room. This silence felt clean. It felt like a fresh blanket of snow. She opened her eyes and looked out at the hundreds of empty seats stretching out into the darkness. They were just shapes in the shadows, but to her, they looked like a sea of ghosts. Ghosts of all the things she had been afraid of for so long. She had played for them, and she hadn't turned to stone. A small, tired smile touched her lips. She knew she hadn't played perfectly. She knew a music teacher would have had a list of technical corrections a mile long. Her timing had been rushed in the fast parts, and her touch had been a little heavy on the low notes. But it didn't matter. It had been real. It had been raw. It had been the truth. She lifted her hands from the keys and placed them gently in her lap. The cool air of the stage brushed against her damp face. She felt lighter, as if she had been carrying a backpack full of stones for years, and had finally taken it off. She was just about to slide the bench back and stand up to leave when she heard a sound. It was the soft creak of a metal hinge coming from the very back of the auditorium. Her heart instantly jumped into her throat. Her body stiffened, and her eyes snapped toward the rear exit door. It was partially open, letting in a sliver of yellow light from the corridor outside. She hadn't heard anyone come in. She had been so lost in the music that the world outside had ceased to exist. Panic washed over her. Who was it? Was it a security guard? Was it the janitor coming to lock up? Or worse, was it one of the students? The fear of being caught, of being kicked out, or worse, of being laughed at again, gripped her stomach. She instinctively grabbed her canvas bag, ready to flee, to run down the steps and out the side door before she could be humiliated. But then, a figure stepped out of the shadows near the back wall. It wasn't a security guard. It was a woman. She was dressed in a long coat and had a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. Her hair was streaked with gray, and she carried a leather tote bag. The woman stood still for a moment, leaning against the back wall, just watching the stage. The woman on the piano bench recognized her. It was the head of the music department. She had seen her picture on the bulletin board in the hallway, a formidable woman known for being strict, for being a genius, and for suffering no fools. Students were terrified of her. She was the kind of person who could end a career with a single sentence. The blood drained from the pianist's face. She felt small again. This was it. She was going to get scolded. She was going to be told that she had no right to touch the expensive instrument. She was trespassing, that she was a disgrace. She shrank back on the bench, wishing she could disappear into the polished wood of the piano. The professor at the back didn't speak. She didn't shout. She didn't flick on the lights. She just stood there in the dim, yellow glow from the hallway, her face unreadable from that distance. The silence stretched out, tense and agonizing. Every second felt like an hour. The woman on the stage wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain. But her voice was gone. And then, the professor slowly raised her hands. She brought them together in a single, deliberate clap. Clap. It was a soft sound in the giant hall, barely a whisper. But it cut through the air like a knife. Then she clapped again. Clap. She wasn't clapping rapidly or loudly. It wasn't a thunderous ovation. It was a slow, rhythmic, respectful clap. She stood there, leaning against the wall, clapping for the woman in the worn coat on the stage. Tears immediately sprang to the pianist's eyes. She didn't wipe them away. She just sat there, stunned. She had expected anger. She had expected ridicule. She had never, in her wildest dreams, expected this. The professor stopped clapping, but didn't move. Her voice carried clearly across the empty seats, calm and low. You play like you have something to say. The woman on the bench trembled. I'm sorry, she stammered, her voice cracking. I know I'm not supposed to be here. I'll leave. The professor shook her head slightly and took a few steps down the aisle, moving out of the shadows. Don't be sorry. Most of the students who practice in this building play like they are trying to impress a judge. They play with their brains. You play with your heart. You play with your life. She stopped a few rows back from the stage. Music isn't about the notes. Anyone can learn the notes. It's about the space between the notes. It's about the silence. You understand that? The older woman on the bench felt a sob rising in her chest, but she swallowed it down. They laughed at me, she whispered, finally saying the words out loud to someone who mattered. The students. They said I was too old. They said I sounded terrible. They laughed because they are scared, the professor said, her voice firm. They are scared because they have all the talent in the world, but they don't have the courage you just showed. They practiced to pass a test. You played to save your soul. There is no competition there. She looked at the woman on the stage with a look of genuine respect. Don't let anyone tell you to be quiet. You have a voice. You need to keep using it. The professor stayed for another moment, gave a small, curt nod, and then turned and walked back up the aisle. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind her, leaving the two women alone in their separate worlds again. But the woman on the stage didn't feel alone anymore. She sat there for a long time, letting the tears finally spill over and run down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, and they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of release. The old man in the park had told her she had a song inside her, and tonight, the most important musician in the building had heard it. She looked down at her hands resting on the shining black piano. They were still rough and calloused. They were still the hands of a factory worker, but they were hands that could make music. Eventually, she slid the bench back and stood up. Her legs felt steady. She picked up her bag and walked to the edge of the stage. She turned back for one last look at the piano under the spotlight. It was just a machine, but it had given her a gift greater than any instrument. She walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing loudly now. She didn't sneak out. She walked with her head high. She pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The city was still humming, the cars still driving by, the streetlights still flickering. But the world looked different to her now. The gray colors seemed a little brighter. The noise didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a rhythm she could move to. She didn't know if she would ever become a great pianist. She didn't know if she would ever perform for a real crowd. But that didn't matter anymore. She knew who she was. She wasn't just a worker, and she wasn't just a dreamer. She was a musician. She put her hand in her pocket and touched the rough wooden bird the old man had given her. She walked toward the bus stop, but she didn't take the bus. She decided to walk. She wanted to feel the ground beneath her feet. She wanted to feel the wind on her face. She walked home with a melody in her heart that nobody could ever take away.